Sarah Thompson was the only daughter of Richard and Eleanor Thompson, owners of Thompson Publishing, one of the most successful publishing companies in the city. The Thompsons were well known in high society circles and took great pride in their wealth and status. They had raised Sarah to expect the best of everything, sending her to elite schools and introducing her to the children of other wealthy families. Michael Chen was different from the men Sarah usually dated. He was handsome, kind, and worked as an architect at a respected firm. What the Thompsons didn't know was that Michael came from wealth too, though his family had a very different approach to showing it. When Sarah brought Michael home to meet her parents for the first time, they were polite but reserved. They asked about his family, his education, and his career goals. Michael spoke honestly about growing up with his father after his mother passed away when he was only 7 years old. "And what does your father do?" Eleanor asked, carefully watching Michael's reaction. "He works in business management," Michael replied simply. "He's been doing it for about 30 years now." Richard Thompson nodded, clearly unimpressed. The vague description suggested to him that James Chen was probably a middle manager at some unremarkable company. 6 months later, when Michael proposed to Sarah with a beautiful but modest diamond ring, she said yes immediately. They decided to invite both families to a dinner to celebrate their engagement. Sarah was nervous about her parents meeting Michael's father for the first time. "Just remember, my dad is very different from your parents," Michael warned her. "He doesn't care much about showing off. He's a simple man who values hard work and honesty." The dinner was held at an expensive restaurant chosen by the Thompsons. James Chen arrived 10 minutes late, dressed in a clean but clearly old suit. His watch was not a luxury brand, and he drove a 5-year-old car that Richard Thompson noticed with a small frown when they all walked to the parking lot together. During dinner, the difference between the families became even more obvious. While the Thompsons ordered the most expensive wine and talked loudly about their recent vacation to Europe, James Chen spoke softly, asking questions about Sarah and showing genuine interest in getting to know her. "So, Mr. Chen, Michael tells us you're in business management," Richard said with a slightly mocking tone. "Which company do you work for?" "I work with several companies," James answered with a small smile. "I help them grow and become more successful." Eleanor raised her eyebrows and exchanged a look with her husband. To them, this vague answer confirmed their suspicions that James was not very successful and probably worked for a small, unimportant business. As the wedding plans began, the Thompsons took control. They insisted on paying for everything, making it clear they didn't expect James to contribute. "We want the best for our daughter," Richard said, looking directly at James. "The Plaza Hotel, top caterers, and a designer dress. I'm sure you understand that these things come with a certain price tag." James simply nodded and thanked them for their generosity. Michael started to say something, but James placed a hand on his son's arm, stopping him. What the Thompsons didn't know was that James Chen was not just in business management. He was the founder and CEO of Chen Enterprises, a global investment firm that owned companies across 3 continents. And among his recent acquisitions was a controlling interest in Thompson Publishing, a fact he had chosen not to mention. The wedding planning moved forward quickly. Every Saturday, Sarah, her mother Eleanor, and sometimes Michael would meet at expensive shops to pick everything from flowers to table decorations. James was never invited to these meetings. "It's probably better this way," Eleanor told Sarah one day while looking at wedding invitations. "Your future father-in-law wouldn't understand the importance of proper cardstock and embossed lettering. These things require a certain taste." Sarah felt uncomfortable with her mother's comments but stayed quiet. She loved Michael and wanted their families to get along. 3 months before the wedding, the Thompsons hosted a dinner party at their large house. They invited friends, family members, and important business partners. Michael and his father were also on the guest list, though Eleanor made sure to mention it was a formal event when she called to invite James. "Do you think he even owns a proper suit?" Richard joked to his wife after the call. "Maybe we should tell him where to rent one." On the night of the party, most guests arrived in luxury cars and designer clothes. James Chen drove up in his modest sedan, wearing a simple black suit that was clean and well-fitted, but clearly not expensive. As the evening went on, Richard made sure to introduce all his important friends to Michael, but conveniently forgot to include James in these conversations. James didn't seem to mind. He quietly enjoyed his food and spoke politely with whoever was seated near him. During dinner, Richard stood up to make a toast about the upcoming wedding. "We are so pleased to welcome Michael into our family," he said, raising his glass. "While we're just now getting to know his family," he glanced at James with a small smile, "we're certain that Michael's good qualities must come from somewhere." Some guests laughed softly at this backhanded compliment. Michael's face turned red with anger, but James just nodded politely and raised his glass. Later that night, in the privacy of their apartment, Michael exploded with frustration. "I can't believe how they treat my father. Do they have any idea who he is? What he's accomplished?" "Maybe we should tell them," Sarah suggested. "It might make things easier." James, who had stopped by to drop off a wedding gift, overheard their conversation from the hallway. "No," he said firmly, entering the room. "I don't want them to respect me because of money or business success. If they can't respect me as a person, then their opinion doesn't matter." Meanwhile, at Thompson Publishing, problems were starting to appear. Their newest magazine wasn't selling well, and costs were rising. Richard had to meet with the board of directors to discuss these issues. "We need to be careful with our spending," said one board member. "There are rumors that a large percentage of our company's shares have been bought by an outside investor." "What? Who?" Richard demanded. "We don't know yet. The purchases were made through different small companies, all apparently leading back to one parent company called Chen Enterprises." Richard didn't connect this name to Michael's father. How could he? James Chen was just a simple business manager in his mind, not the head of a major investment firm. As the wedding date got closer, tensions grew. The Thompsons continued to exclude James from important decisions while making comments about his apparent lack of wealth and connections. During the menu tasting, Eleanor asked James if certain foods might be too exotic for his palate. At the venue walkthrough, Richard loudly wondered if James had ever even been inside such an expensive hotel before. Through it all, James remained calm and kind. He never corrected their assumptions or revealed his true position. Michael grew more frustrated each day, but respected his father's wishes to keep their family's wealth private. What no one knew was that James had already decided how to handle the situation. He would wait for the perfect moment, when the truth would have the greatest impact. That moment was coming soon. 1 month before the wedding, tension at Thompson Publishing reached a breaking point. Richard Thompson sat in his office, staring at financial reports that made no sense to him. Sales were down, expenses were up, and their biggest printing contract had just been cancelled without explanation. "Sir, the board members are waiting in the conference room," his assistant said, looking worried. Richard straightened his tie and walked into the meeting room with false confidence. 8 serious faces looked up at him as he entered. "What's this emergency meeting about?" Richard asked, though he already knew. Martin Wells, the longest-serving board member, spoke first. "Richard, we've discovered something concerning. Over the past year, Chen Enterprises has purchased 45% of Thompson Publishing's shares." 45%? Richard's voice cracked. "How is that possible? Who is this Chen Enterprises?" "It's a private investment company known for buying struggling businesses and turning them around," explained Martin. "They're very secretive, but extremely successful. Their CEO rarely appears in public." "Can we buy back the shares?" Richard asked desperately. "With what money?" Another board member asked. "We're already struggling to pay our current expenses." Richard left the meeting feeling sick. His family's company, built by his father and grandfather, was slipping away from him. He didn't tell Eleanor about these problems. She was too busy with wedding preparations, and he didn't want to worry her. Meanwhile, Sarah and Michael were having dinner with James at his modest apartment. Despite the Thompsons' assumptions, James lived in a comfortable but simple 3-bedroom apartment. He could have afforded a mansion but preferred to live without showing off his wealth. "Dad, I wish you would let me tell Sarah's parents the truth," Michael said, helping clear the dinner plates. "The way they treat you is unacceptable." James smiled patiently. "Son, I've dealt with people like the Thompsons my whole life. Men who think nice clothes and expensive cars make them important. I don't need their approval." Sarah looked down, embarrassed by her parents' behavior. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Chen. They weren't always like this. The wedding has made them more intense." James patted her hand kindly. "Please call me James, and don't worry about me. I'm more concerned about your father's company. Sarah looked surprised. What do you mean? I've heard Thompson Publishing is having financial troubles, James said carefully. Has your father mentioned anything? No, Sarah replied, looking worried. Dad always says business is great. The wedding budget seems unlimited. James nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing more on the subject. The next day, Richard received a call from his assistant. Sir, there's someone from Chen Enterprises here to see you. A Ms. Linda Wu. Richard straightened his tie nervously. Send her in. A professional-looking woman in her 40s entered his office carrying a small briefcase. Mr. Thompson, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I'm Linda Wu, Chief Operations Officer at Chen Enterprises. What can I do for you? Richard asked, trying to sound confident. I'm here to inform you that Chen Enterprises now owns 51% of Thompson Publishing shares. We have majority control, she stated simply. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. That's impossible. The board would have told me if more shares were sold. The final 6% was purchased yesterday from Mr. Wells, Linda explained. Our CEO has asked me to deliver this message. Nothing will change immediately. You will remain as the public face of the company for now. We will meet after your daughter's wedding to discuss the future direction of Thompson Publishing. Your CEO knows about my daughter's wedding? Richard asked, confused. Linda smiled slightly. Our CEO knows a great deal about you and your family, Mr. Thompson. More than you might expect. After Linda left, Richard sat at his desk, stunned. His company was no longer his. But who was this mysterious CEO who was giving him time until after the wedding? And how did they know about his personal life? That evening, Richard told Eleanor everything. For once, her perfect composure cracked. What does this mean? Will we lose everything? She asked, panic in her voice. I don't know, Richard admitted. But we can't let anyone know about this before the wedding. We must keep up appearances. They agreed to continue as if nothing had changed. The wedding would go on as planned, lavish, expensive, and impressive to all their friends. But behind their smiles, fear and uncertainty grew stronger each day. 2 weeks before the wedding, the rehearsal dinner was scheduled at the Grand Hotel, one of the most expensive venues in the city. Eleanor Thompson had spent days planning every detail, from the flower arrangements to the 5-course meal. Remember, everything must be perfect, she told the hotel manager. Our guests include the mayor and several important business leaders. On the afternoon of the rehearsal dinner, Richard was unusually quiet as he dressed in his expensive suit. The situation at Thompson Publishing was getting worse. 3 major authors had suddenly canceled their contracts, and a competing publisher had somehow stolen their biggest advertiser. Are you still thinking about work? Eleanor asked, putting on her diamond earrings. Focus on tonight. We need to show everyone that the Thompsons still stand at the top of society. When they arrived at the hotel, Eleanor immediately began checking every detail. She rearranged the seating chart, placing James Chen at a table far from the main family table, with some distant relatives Sarah barely knew. Mother, why is Michael's father sitting all the way over there? Sarah asked when she noticed the arrangement. It's better this way, dear, Eleanor replied. He'll feel more comfortable with people who won't talk about things he doesn't understand. Sarah wanted to argue but was interrupted when guests began arriving. Michael looked handsome in his tuxedo, greeting everyone with warm smiles, but his father was nowhere to be seen. As the time for dinner approached, James Chen still hadn't arrived. Eleanor didn't hide her annoyance. This shows exactly what kind of man he is, she whispered to Richard. No sense of time or responsibility. Michael checked his phone constantly, looking worried. He said he was caught in an important business meeting. He should be here soon. Richard laughed quietly. What kind of important business could he possibly have? Almost an hour after the dinner was supposed to start, James Chen finally arrived. He apologized sincerely to everyone, especially to Sarah and Michael. Unlike the other men in expensive tuxedos, James wore a simple black suit that seemed slightly wrinkled. So sorry I'm late, he said with a small bow. There was an unexpected situation with a company in Singapore. Eleanor smiled tightly. Singapore? How exotic. Please take your seat, Mr. Chen. We've held dinner long enough. James nodded politely and found his assigned table in the far corner of the room. Michael looked angry, but James shook his head slightly, signaling his son not to make a scene. During dinner, Richard stood to make a toast. To my beautiful daughter and her fiancé. We welcome Michael to our family and hope he'll learn the Thompson values of excellence and achievement. He paused, looking directly at James Chen sitting quietly in the corner. And we also welcome Michael's father, who has finally joined us. Better late than never, eh? Several guests laughed, while others looked uncomfortable. Michael's face turned red with anger, but James simply smiled and raised his glass. Later, as dessert was served, Eleanor made a point of stopping by James's table. I hope the food is to your liking, Mr. Chen. I wasn't sure if you'd be used to such refined cuisine. It's excellent, James replied kindly, though I've had the pleasure of dining at the Grand many times before. Eleanor looked surprised. Really? For special occasions, I suppose? Sometimes, James answered with a small smile, and sometimes for business. Before Eleanor could respond, her phone rang. She excused herself to answer it. Eleanor, it's Martin Wells from the board, the voice said urgently. I just received information that Chen Enterprises is planning major changes at Thompson Publishing immediately after the wedding. I thought you should know. Eleanor's hand trembled as she ended the call. She rejoined Richard, whispering the news to him. They both looked pale. We need to find out who runs this Chen Enterprises, Richard said. Maybe we can negotiate, offer something. Across the room, James Chen's phone also rang. He answered it quietly, speaking in fluent Mandarin. No one at the dinner could understand what he was saying, but his face became serious as he listened. After the call, James walked over to Michael and spoke to him quietly. Michael looked shocked for a moment, then nodded. Is everything okay? Sarah asked when Michael returned to her side. Yes, Michael said, looking across the room at his father, who was now calmly eating his dessert. Everything is about to work out exactly as it should. The day of the wedding finally arrived. The Plaza Hotel was transformed with thousands of white roses, crystal decorations, and gold accents. The guest list included 300 people, most of them friends and business connections of the Thompsons. Sarah looked beautiful in her designer wedding dress that cost more than most people's cars. Eleanor fussed around her, adjusting the veil and reminding her to stand straight for the photographs. Remember, these pictures will be in all the society magazines, Eleanor said. The Thompson wedding must be perfect. Meanwhile, in another room, Michael was getting ready with his groomsmen and his father. James Chen wore a simple black tuxedo that was well made but not designer quality like the other men in the wedding party. Dad, are you sure you want to go through with this? Michael asked quietly. After how they've treated you, we could still cancel. James straightened his son's tie. Today is about love, not pride. You love Sarah, and that's what matters. As guests arrived, Richard and Eleanor Thompson stood at the entrance, greeting everyone with practiced smiles. They welcomed CEOs, politicians, and celebrities, making sure everyone noticed the important people attending their daughter's wedding. When James arrived at the main entrance, Richard barely acknowledged him with a quick handshake. Eleanor looked at his tuxedo and raised her eyebrows. At least he made an effort, she whispered to Richard, not realizing James could hear her. The ceremony was beautiful. Sarah and Michael exchanged heartfelt vows that brought tears to many guests' eyes. Throughout the ceremony, Eleanor kept glancing at her phone, worried about the news from Martin Wells about Chen Enterprises. After the ceremony, while the wedding party took photographs, Richard pulled James aside. Listen, I know we haven't always been welcoming, Richard began awkwardly, but you raised a good son. Michael seems like a hard worker. James nodded. Thank you. That means a lot to me. Richard continued, trying to sound casual. So, you mentioned you work with different companies. Any chance you've heard of Chen Enterprises? James's face remained neutral. The name sounds familiar. Why, you ask? Just curious, Richard said quickly. They've invested in my publishing company recently. Invested? That's good news, James replied. Richard laughed nervously. Well, taken over might be more accurate, but nobody knows who runs it. Very mysterious. Before James could respond, the photographer called Richard back for family pictures. When it was time for photos with James, Eleanor suggested they just take a few quick ones and positioned him at the edge of the group where he could easily be cropped out later. At the reception, the Thompsons had arranged the seating so that James was at a table far from the wedding party. The table card identified him simply as M. Chen's father rather than by his name. When James discovered this, he said nothing and took his seat. One of the guests at his table, an older woman, looked at him sympathetically. "The Thompsons can be quite snobby," she whispered. "I'm only here because my husband does business with Richard." James smiled. Family dynamics are always interesting. The dinner service began with expensive champagne and gourmet food. When it was time for speeches, Richard stood first, talking about his wonderful daughter and how he had spared no expense to give her the perfect wedding. "Nothing is too good for a Thompson," he declared, raising his glass. "And now Michael is part of our family with all the privileges and responsibilities that come with it." When it was James's turn to speak, Eleanor whispered to Richard, "I hope he keeps it short." What could he possibly have to say? As James walked to the microphone, several guests looked surprised, as if they hadn't noticed him before. He straightened his simple black tie and cleared his throat. Just as he was about to speak, Richard stood up again. "Before Mr. Chen says a few words, I just want to remind everyone that the night is young and we have wonderful entertainment planned. So let's keep the speeches brief." The room fell silent at this obvious insult. James looked at Richard for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Thank you for that introduction, Mr. Thompson," James said quietly into the microphone. The entire room waited to hear what he would say next. The reception hall remained completely silent as James Chen stood at the microphone. Even the servers stopped moving, sensing the tension in the room. Michael looked worried, while Sarah squeezed his hand supportively. "First, I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate my son Michael's marriage to the beautiful Sarah," James began in a clear, confident voice that surprised many guests. "When my late wife and I had Michael 28 years ago, I promised her I would raise him to be a man of character and kindness." James paused, looking directly at his son with pride. "I see before me a young man who chose his partner not for her family name or wealth, but for her heart. Sarah, welcome to our family, small as it may be." Several guests nodded in approval at these warm words. Eleanor Thompson shifted uncomfortably in her seat, confused by James' unexpected eloquence. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," James continued, turning to face them, "you have raised a wonderful daughter. For that, you have my sincere respect. I know our families come from different worlds. You value status and appearances. I have always valued hard work and humility." Richard's face grew red, recognizing the subtle criticism in James's words. Eleanor nervously twisted her diamond bracelet. "My own parents were immigrants who worked 16-hour days to give me opportunities," James continued. "When I started my first business 30 years ago, I had nothing but determination and a small loan from my father's savings." The room remained captivated. James spoke without notes, his words flowing naturally. "I promised myself that if I ever found success, I would remain the same person I was when I had nothing. That's the most important lesson I taught Michael, that a person's character matters more than their possessions." Just then, a woman in a professional black suit entered the reception hall and walked directly to James. She whispered something in his ear and handed him a folder. Many guests recognized her as Linda Wu, a well-known business executive. "Please excuse this interruption," James said to the crowd. "It seems business follows me everywhere, even to my son's wedding." James quickly reviewed the documents in the folder. "Just as I thought. Thank you, Linda." Linda Wu nodded respectfully and took a seat at a nearby table. The guests began whispering to each other, confused by this strange interruption. James returned to his speech. "As I was saying, I believe in hard work and humility. I also believe in honesty. So perhaps it's time for some honesty between our families." Michael started to stand, but James gestured for him to remain seated. "For the past year, Richard, your publishing company has been struggling. Your expenses exceed your income, and several poor business decisions have damaged your reputation in the industry." Richard Thompson stood up angrily. "How dare you discuss my business at my daughter's wedding? What would you know about running a major company anyway?" James remained calm. "I know quite a bit, actually. The documents I just signed approve a complete restructuring of Thompson Publishing, beginning next week." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Eleanor grabbed her husband's arm, forcing him to sit down. "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, his voice shaking. James held up the folder. "These papers confirm Chen Enterprises' complete acquisition of Thomson Publishing. As CEO and founder of Chen Enterprises, I just approved the final details." The shock in the room was immediate. Guests gasped and turned to each other in disbelief. Richard and Eleanor sat frozen, their faces pale with shock. "You?" Eleanor finally managed to say. "You are the CEO of Chen Enterprises." James nodded. "For the past 30 years, we own companies in 12 countries, with Thomson Publishing being our most recent acquisition." Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Several of his business associates at nearby tables looked at James with new interest and respect. "But your apartment, your car, your clothes," Eleanor stammered. "Are exactly what I choose to have," James replied simply. "My worth isn't determined by what I own, but by what I build and who I help." The silence that followed was deafening. Every guest waited to see what would happen next. James folded the papers and handed them back to Linda Wu. Then he raised his champagne glass. "Now let's return to what really matters today, celebrating Sarah and Michael's love, to the bride and groom." The guests automatically raised their glasses, still processing the shocking revelation. As James returned to his seat, the room exploded with conversation. The reception continued in a strange atmosphere after James's revelation. The band played cheerful music, but the guests were more interested in whispering about what had just happened. Richard and Eleanor Thompson sat at the main table, barely touching their expensive food, still in shock. "Did you know about this?" Eleanor whispered fiercely to Sarah. Sarah shook her head. "I had no idea, Mom. Michael never told me his father was so successful." Across the room, business leaders and city officials who had previously ignored James were now finding reasons to approach his table. They offered business cards and friendly handshakes, suddenly eager to connect with the powerful CEO they had overlooked. "Mr. Chen, I've always admired your company's work in renewable energy," said the mayor, who earlier had barely nodded at James during the ceremony. James smiled politely, but didn't engage in business talk. "Today is for my son and his new wife. Perhaps we can speak next week at my office." Meanwhile, Richard Thompson was having a quiet breakdown at the family table. "We're ruined," he whispered to Eleanor. "You'll fire us immediately. How could we have been so blind?" "Pull yourself together," Eleanor hissed. "People are watching. We need to save what's left of our reputation." Michael noticed his new-in-law's distress and leaned over to speak with his father. "Dad, I think the Thompsons are really upset. Maybe you should talk to them." James considered this for a moment, then nodded. He stood up and walked across the reception hall to the main table. Guests watched closely, wondering what would happen next in this real-life drama. "May I join you for a moment?" James asked politely. Richard nodded stiffly, his face still pale. Eleanor tried to maintain her usual perfect posture, but her hands trembled as she clutched her napkin. "I apologize for the timing of my announcement," James said quietly. "It wasn't my intention to disrupt Sarah and Michael's special day." "Why didn't you tell us who you really were?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James looked at her thoughtfully. "Would it have changed how you treated me? Would you have respected me as a person, or only my bank account?" Richard and Eleanor had no answer for this. They looked down at the table, embarrassed. "I wanted Michael to find someone who loved him for himself, not for his family's money or connections," James continued. "So we always lived simply. Michael earned his own way through college and his career. He never used my name or connections to get ahead." "But the company," Richard finally managed to say. "My family built that company. 3 generations of Thompsons." "And you'll still have a place there," James said, surprising them both. "I didn't buy Thomson Publishing to destroy it. I bought it because, despite its recent problems, it has potential. With better management and some new ideas, it can be successful again." Eleanor looked up, hope showing in her eyes for the first time. "You're not firing us." "That depends on you," James replied honestly. "Are you willing to work under new leadership? To accept changes to how the company operates? To perhaps learn some new approaches to publishing?" Before they could answer, Linda Wu approached the table again, "Excuse me, Mr. Chen, but we have that conference call with Tokyo in 15 minutes. We've set up a private room in the hotel as you requested." James nodded. "Thank you, Linda." He turned back to the Thompsons. "We'll continue this conversation on Monday at my office. For now, let's remember we're family now, through Sarah and Michael. Nothing is more important than that." As James walked away, Richard and Eleanor looked at each other, trying to process everything that had happened. "He seems fair," Eleanor said slowly. "Not what I expected. We misjudged him completely," Richard admitted. "Made fools of ourselves in front of everyone." Across the room, Sarah and Michael were dancing their first dance as husband and wife, looking happy and in love. They seemed completely unaware of the drama happening around them. James stood at the edge of the dance floor, watching his son with pride. Several guests approached him, including some who had previously ignored him or treated him poorly. He greeted everyone with the same calm politeness, without showing any sign of satisfaction at their changed behavior. As the evening continued, one thing became clear to everyone in the room. James Chen was a man of remarkable character who valued people for who they were, not what they owned or what status they held. And that lesson was perhaps the most valuable wedding gift he could have given to the young couple starting their new life together. 1 month after the wedding, Sarah and Michael returned from their honeymoon in Bali. Their first family dinner was scheduled at a private dining room in one of the city's best restaurants. James Chen had arranged everything, inviting both families to celebrate the newlyweds' return. Richard and Eleanor Thompson arrived 15 minutes early, dressed perfectly but clearly nervous. The past month had been difficult for them. News of their behavior at the wedding and James Chen's true identity had spread quickly through their social circles. Many of their so-called friends had suddenly become distant. "Remember, be humble but not pathetic," Eleanor whispered to Richard as they entered the restaurant. "We need to show him we can adapt." James was already there, dressed in a simple but well-made suit. He greeted them warmly, as if the past tensions had never existed. "Richard, Eleanor, thank you for coming. Sarah and Michael should be here soon." The Thompsons sat down awkwardly. For the first time in their lives, they didn't know how to act or what to say. They were used to being the powerful ones in any room. "How has your month been?" James asked politely. Richard cleared his throat. "Different. Very different. The changes at the company have been significant." The Monday after the wedding, Richard and Eleanor had gone to the Chen Enterprises headquarters for their meeting with James. Instead of firing them, James had offered Richard a position as a senior advisor, using his industry connections and experience to help rebuild the company. Eleanor was asked to lead a new division focusing on digital content for women. "Are you finding your new roles challenging?" James asked, sipping his water. Eleanor nodded. "I never thought I'd enjoy working with young editors and creators, but it's surprisingly rewarding. They have so many fresh ideas." "And the salary adjustment?" James asked directly. Richard winced slightly. Their income had been reduced by 60%, forcing them to sell their vacation home and one of their cars. "We're managing," Richard said with unexpected dignity. "Actually, it's been good to simplify some things." James nodded approvingly. Just then, Sarah and Michael arrived, tanned and happy from their honeymoon. The awkwardness faded as they shared stories about beautiful beaches and local foods. After dinner, James proposed a toast. "To new beginnings and valuable lessons. Family is our greatest wealth." As they all raised their glasses, Eleanor suddenly said, "I owe you an apology, James. We treated you terribly because we thought you weren't important enough. We were wrong in so many ways." James smiled kindly. "We all make mistakes, Eleanor. What matters is how we learn from them." Richard added, "I've been wondering something. You could have humiliated us much worse than you did. You knew all along that our company was struggling, that we were living beyond our means. Why didn't you expose us sooner?" "What would that have accomplished?" James asked. "Revenge isn't a good foundation for any relationship, especially a family one." Michael looked proudly at his father. "That's what my dad taught me growing up. Judge people by their character, not their possessions, and always give people a chance to show their best selves." Sarah reached out and took Eleanor's hand. "Mom, I hope you can see now why I fell in love with Michael. His family values are the ones I want for our children someday." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, I see that now. As the evening ended, James invited everyone to his home for dinner the following month. Not my apartment, he clarified with a small smile. My actual home. The Thompsons looked surprised. You don't live in that apartment? Eleanor asked. James chuckled. That was my first apartment when I started my business. I keep it for sentimental reasons and sometimes stay there when I work late. My house is a bit farther from the city. 2 weeks later, when the Thompsons arrived at James's house, they were shocked to find a beautiful but modest 5-bedroom home with a large garden. It wasn't the mansion they had expected from a billionaire CEO, but it was warm and clearly a place filled with love and memories. As they walked through the front door, Eleanor noticed a simple framed photo of a young James with his late wife, holding baby Michael. In that moment, she finally understood. True wealth wasn't about showing off or impressing others. It was about creating a life of purpose and love. And that was a lesson worth more than any company.